The first time I watched The Shining was a few years ago, and the experience was quite surreal. I remember being sat in my grandparents' living room, surrounded in complete darkness. I put in the DVD, and eventually the whole room was illuminated by The Shining opening sequence. And if that wasn't haunting enough, the visuals and the imagery spooked me ever since. It was actually the first ever horror film that really actually scared me. But then, after a bit of time, I realised The Shining as a film wasn't actually the real scare. The real scare was Shelley Duvall.
Come out, wherever you are. It doesn't help you, wouldn't it?
Yes, it does. It does. Yes, I know.
Right, okay. Boys, want the video's going to be around here. Get this all set up.
Shelley Duvall had never trained as an actress. She learnt it on the job. Born in 1949 and raised in Texas, Duvall was discovered by Robert Altman while shooting Brewster McCloud in Houston. During time away from filming, Altman spotted her at a party that was hosted by the parents of Duvall's then boyfriend. Unknowing to who he was, she spoke to him about painting until he asked, "How would you like to be in a movie?" Originally, she protested the idea but later gave in. She was reported to saying, "She got tired of arguing and thought maybe I'm an actress. They told me to come. I simply got on a plane and did it. I was swept away." Before then, she had never been out of Texas. She had her first credit in Altman's feature, and then Duvall played a variety of roles. A mail-order bride in McCabe and Mrs. Miller, Keechie, a mistress in Thieves Like Us, and a year later, a groupie in Nashville. By 1976, she was starring on Saturday Night Live, alongside George Harrison and Paul Simon, whom she dated. The two lived together for a few years, until Duvall introduced a musician to her friend, Carrie Fisher, of Star Wars fame. By then, their relationship was over quicker than you can say. Simon took Fisher out on a date to Studio 54, and by 1983, they were married. Amidst the breakup, Duvall went to England to begin shooting for The Shining, quoted as to being in ill health, both mentally and physically, by the team on set. Right, action. When did you first see The Shining?
First saw The Shining on TV, and I think it was its first time it had been broadcast on Channel 4 or something like that. That was the first time I've seen it, but subsequently I've ended up seeing it at the cinema.
Probably in like 2013, I'd say.
It was actually earlier this year, so I'm late to the party on it, but
What do you think about The Shining?
I really like it. I like the cinematic shots in it and the fact that Stanley Kubrick directed it, because he's one of my inspirations.
It has quite a deep meaning, in my opinion. It explores human mind and what can go on in different people's heads.
I'm a big Stephen King fan, always have been, and I read The Shining, I read the book, I've read lots of Stephen King books, and The Shining book always stood out to me. And I like it a lot. It's not my favourite King adaptation, and the flaws that Stephen King has in it, I sort of agree with. But as a film that's a psychological thriller as opposed to the haunted house story that King wrote, I think it's tremendous. And I think being a big Kubrick fan, it just pushes all the buttons, and it's so memorable, and it's transcended just being a film. It's a piece of iconography now.
It's a good film. It's not bad. I wouldn't say it's one of the best horror films, but it's alright.
Tell me anything or everything you know about Shelley Duvall.
The only things which I know is that she actually suffers from a mental illness.
I know Shelley Duvall had some experience with children's TV show, I think. I know that she was mistreated in the making of The Shining.
She was quite big before she was in The Shining. Obviously everyone knows her through that. She's the screaming, hysterical one in that.
Shelley Duvall was a kind of ingenuine actress that came out through the 60s. She was one of the actors that Robert Altman would always go to, and so she was used extensively as one of his go-to cast, and Altman was very famous for having a go-to cast.
Her mental health wasn't that great after The Shining, because she was like abused and stuff on the set.
I knew that it affected her life in a lot of ways through making The Shining. She had hair loss, she had all sorts of problems during the production of it, and Stanley Kubrick was the person behind that.
In the 70s, she was one of those really big stars that was everywhere. She was quirky in the way the 70s stars had a tendency to be. She was in one of my favourite Altman films, a film called Brewster McCloud. And she just had a style, and she had a look that made her very much of the time. And then she went into television. I remember doing the Fairy Tale Theatre, which I think she produced and she was in. She was in Time Bandits for Terry Gilliam, and then sort of disappeared really, and kind of vanished off the big screen.
Jack's such a big star, such a famous personality, that people do tend to be a bit sycophantic with him. But it wasn't everyone, but some people did. And it wasn't entirely ineffectual. I mean, I did get jealous sometimes, I must admit.
Why was that?
Well, it was mostly between takes, not during work. I mean, when we were actually working on a scene, that did not interfere at all. But on occasions when we were just sitting around or about to come to work or standing by in our rooms, whatever. I mean, there were times where I felt a bit jealous because he got very, very much attention. And I suppose I like attention.
While Duvall was in London shooting The Shining, Altman asked her to play Olive Oil in his big screen adaptation of Popeye opposite Robin Williams, a role Roger Ebert believes she was born to play. Shelley Duvall is like a precious piece of china with a tinkling personality. She looks and sounds like almost nobody else, and if it is true that she was born to play the character Olive Oil and does so in Altman's new musical Popeye, it is also true that she has possibly played more really different kind of characters than almost any other young actress of the 1970s. Shortly before the release of the film Time Bandits 1981, which followed The Shining the year after, it was reported that Duvall and Stanley Wilson, who portrayed the town barber in Popeye, were set to marry. However, no further reports were released following this. Kubrick, on the set of The Shining, changed the script daily, making it confusing for the actors.
First, you get very methodical, and each time you make a new version, you put in a different color. After a while, you're lucky if people get copies of the changes.
It's so that you start with white, then you go to blue, then pink, then green, then yellow.
But what happens
It's
is
so that when everybody's got their script out, you can look right over and know if they've got the latest version. But of course, you
But it
never
doesn't work
have the
out.
latest version. I quit using my script. I just take the ones they type up each day.
Aren't you exaggerating a little bit?
No.
After filming The Shining, Stanley moved to a ranch where he would rarely leave. He hoarded lots of his own stuff, which can be seen in the documentary Stanley Kubrick's Boxes. He had a 200 IQ. Stanley Kubrick was born in New York City on July 26, 1928, and worked as a photographer for Look magazine, before exploring filmmaking in the 1950s. His early photography depicted film noir. He grew up in the Bronx, New York, the same place where his father, Jacques Kubrick, worked as a doctor, and his mother, Sadie Kubrick. He had one sibling, Barbara. His first feature, the 1953 military drama Fear and Desire, was made independently, an uncommon practice for the time. Early into his filmmaking career, Kubrick was a cinematographer, editor and soundman, in addition to directing. Later, he would also write and produce. Kubrick married 3 times. His first union was with Toba Etermetz, lasting from 1948 to 1951. He married his second wife, Ruth Sobotka, in 1954 and divorced in 1957. The following year he married his third wife, painter Christiane Harlan, also known as Suzanne Christian. Their marriage lasted 41 years. Harlan produced 2 of Kubrick's 3 daughters, Anya and Vivian. Kubrick also had a stepdaughter, Katharina, Harlan's daughter from a prior relationship. Vivian Kubrick was the one who created the behind-the-scenes footage you're about to see. This footage helps us see the truth.
Come and look at it, Shelley. The only part clearly wrong was at the end when you said we've got to get him out of here, as you got strong at the end, and I think it has to be a last desperate begging, you know? And I still think you shouldn't jump on every single emphatic line. It looks fake. It really does. It looks like you, Shelley, I'm telling you, it's too many times. Every time he speaks emphatically, you're jumping. It looks phony.
So he says, I'll put on my Superman suit.
No, I think that line is right.
Right.
When he lays down.
No, I think that line's in the right place.
Okay, Shelley, so you say, what's the matter with you first?
Because what's the matter with you means, why are you so angry? What is the matter with you? It doesn't mean, what are you talking about?
Well, but this is where he lays down, though. That's the only thing I was thinking of. You know, when he flops back on the bed. Since that is new, I thought it fit, you know, what's the matter with you?
If you talk,
And then he
say
blows
this
up.
right, I'd rather say it here.
Okay.
Right? Honestly, don't think the lines are going to make an awful lot of difference if you get the right attitude. I think you're worrying about the wrong thing. Can we just have a quick chat about it once more, Shelley? Tell them to reduce the snow.
Alan, stand over here! Alan! Alan, reduce the snow a bit, Al.
You can't even hear us. Reduce the snow. They can hear you.
Do I have that stuff in my hand?
I stand by, boys. Okay, Malcolm? Right, roll video.
Get out, Peter.
Video speed, Stanley. Right, clear back, boys. Okay, turning, Doug?
No, wait a minute. I forgot it. Hold it.
Cut it. Keep it rolling.
Keep the video rolling.
Right. Keep video rolling.
Reduce the smoke a little, Alan.
Reduce the smoke a little bit, Al.
Okay, turn over.
Okay, turn over. Right, roll video and action, Shelley.
Action, Shelley! Head it.
Nobody even said roll video.
Desperation. Oh, come on. What do you mean roll
2
video?
seconds.
We're killing ourselves out here, and you're going to be ready.
I am too. I'm standing
we
right
play
by
mood
the
music?
door. No, I
Yeah,
can't
but when you
hear.
came out like this,
We're sitting there because they say, wait a minute,
okay.
and then you say on the radio,
but when you
go.
do it, you've got to look desperate, Shelley. You're just wasting it.
I can't even get the door open. You have on the record, I got such a bollocking because they said, turn over, and they said, video rolling and all that, and I got all ready, jumped up and down, and then they said, never mind, cut it. And then I was taken by a soup. Next thing I know, action, Shelley. So.
At one point, Shelley was reported to saying, Jack Nicholson's character had to be crazy and angry all the time. And in my character, I had to cry 12 hours a day. All day long, the last 9 months straight, 5 or 6 days a week. I was there a year and a month, and there must be something to primal scream therapy, because after the day was over, and I'd cried for my 12 hours, I went home very contented. I had a very calming effect. During the day, I would have been absolutely miserable. After all that work, hardly anyone even criticised my performance in it. The reviews were all about Kubrick, like I wasn't there. What did you think of Shelley's performance?
It was very good in my opinion. I've got nothing to say that was wrong, but at the same time, in my opinion, she had more of acting in a verbal way.
Personally, I'm not a fan of it. I think, if I'm going to be completely honest, I think they could have casted somebody better.
I think she's got an amazingly underwritten role, and I think her character hasn't got an awful lot to do. She reacts more than she's reactive. She has a tendency to be hysterical, and she did the best with the material. But I think the material, as far as her character goes, because Jack Nicholson's got all the juicy lines, I think it's a really weak, underwritten role that she gave the best to.
It's pretty intense to watch, because I imagine the struggle she went through to get that kind of hysteria. It's pretty hard.
It wasn't acting some of the time because she was actually scared and stuff.
Again, she's part of that shining iconography, but the character is really, really weak. The character in the book is much more defiant, is a much stronger character, and I'd like to have seen her have something more to do than just being helpless and screaming.
Director Stanley Kubrick intentionally isolated Shelley Duvall. The scene you're about to watch was recorded 127 times until Kubrick was satisfied.
I'm not gonna hurt you.
Please!
Stop swinging the bat. Put the bat down, Wendy.
Stop it!
Wendy, give me the bat.
Please! Shelley!
Give me the bat.
Stop it!
Give me the bat. Stop swinging the bat.
Please stop!
Give me the bat,
Shelley!
Wendy. Wendy. Give me the bat. Give me the bat.
Ah, God damn!
The question on your mind right now might be, did Stanley Kubrick go too far? I can't tell you, but I can show you.
Recognize this once famous actress? Hard to believe it's Shelley Duvall, best known for her role in the horror classic The Shining opposite Jack Nicholson.
Here's Johnny!
Today, Shelley is 67, and in this bizarre interview, she tells Dr. Phil she's struggling with mental illness.
Are you in good health as far as like your heart and your lungs and everything? Are you
you
fit?
know, damned if I do, damned if I don't. I mean, if I say I'm healthy, first thing they'll do is hurt me tonight.
Who will hurt you?
Whoever is in security or at the bank doing night work.
Well, that's what I want to help you with, because it sounds like you feel like you have some people that are trying to hurt you.
This is okay right now.
Back in the 1980s, Shelley Duvall was considered one of the best young actresses in Hollywood. Her role in The Shining was praised for its poignancy.
I'm gonna go now.
She followed up playing Olive Oyl opposite the late great Robin Williams as Popeye.
Oh, my hero!
I loved Robin.
I was sorry when he died.
But listen to what she says next.
I don't think he's dead.
Yeah, you don't think he's dead?
No.
Where do you think he is?
Shape-shifting.
Yeah.
He looks real good in some forms, in other forms he doesn't.
Do you see him?
Have, yes.
Sad and troubling days for a woman who once had so much promise.
So after seeing that footage, how do you feel?
It's really sad that I mean everybody's allowed to go through mental illness. Everybody's allowed to have problems, and when you're in the public light, you do that thing where you get compared to your younger, more beautiful self, and that's across the board, men and women, and especially for women. So it's really sad that to some extent she's been put in this position where clearly she needs help, and clearly that she has some really troubling issues and health problems.
In The Shining, she had such like a very like slim complexion, pale skin, nice hair. You know, she was attractive, but now it's kind of like looks like a completely different person. When you look at Jack Nicholson, he's aged well since then. I mean, yeah, he's old now, but he's aged well considering everything. But when you look at Shelley Duvall, she looks completely different. It looks like she's had like a hard life.
Quite terrified, to be fair, but as I've said before, no one ever should suffer from a mental illness because it's one of the worst things you can suffer from, and it's not only affecting you, but it's also affecting others.
My problem with it is if it was anybody else, you'd be allowed to get on with your life and you'd be allowed to seek medical attention. But because you've been in the public light and because you've been famous at one point and because there's almost a freak show quality to it, you're not allowed to grow old gracefully. And she's changed considerably. But we all grow old and we all change and we all look different and we all go through some part of our lives where we're not at the best we can be. But clearly she's a person who hopefully is getting medical attention. But just because you're famous or just because you've had an amazing career doesn't mean that you can't suffer like anybody else in the public will be. And I think sometimes the entertainment industry is very cruel and doesn't let you be just like anybody else.
Like I said before, it's quite intense to see someone in that state of mind. It's also quite sad and disturbing to see someone who is clearly struggling, but the way it's kind of been exploited in America is wrong, because as Lee said, if she was a normal person she'd have been given treatment by now, but because she's a celebrity she's not allowed that kind of luxury.
I think Kubrick was a genius filmmaker. Some of my favourite films, all-time favourite films, are Stanley Kubrick films. 2001, Dr. Strangelove. He was an incredible filmmaker, and he pushed the boundaries of filmmaking, and he pushed the boundaries of the sorts of films he wanted to make. He invented technology that we're using today. He was groundbreaking. We throw around the word genius a lot, but Kubrick was one of those. He was, from what I gather, not the easiest person to work with. I've known people who've worked on some of his sets and have some war stories to talk about. But sometimes, if you're going to make an omelette, you've got to break a few eggs, and he clearly was overly passionate about it to the point of maybe even being abusive. I've heard stories, and we've all heard stories of what that genius could make about it. But you can't deny, as a filmmaker, let alone an odd personality, but as a filmmaker alone, he was an absolutely amazing, brilliant filmmaker.
I already thought he was a bit off, so feelings had changed.
The way I see it, you've got to separate the art from the artist. That's how I look at other types of art, like music. Say John Lennon, pretty renowned for being a pretty terrible bloke, pretty terrible father. He abused one of his girlfriends, his wife, and he didn't truly kind of correct himself until he died. But he's one of the greatest musicians ever, and no one will ever deny that. And I think that's the same with Stanley Kubrick. You've just got to separate the art from the artist. A lot of artists go through a period where they're not great people, but they do incredible things. So you just got to look at it that way. If you get bogged down in what the person's like, you're not appreciating them for what they fully are.
Honestly, I love him with my entire heart. I don't care how he treated her on The Shining, because at the end of the day, he had a lot riding on that film. Any director does, but especially Stanley Kubrick, because he made such controversial films. And Shelley, when you look at behind-the-scenes footage of it, she was hard to work with because she wasn't hitting a mark, she wasn't hitting, she wasn't getting lines right. And when you're working with someone like Jack Nicholson, you've got to be as good as that. So, I do understand why he did put pressure on her.
Mm. Considering that, do you agree with sacrificing mental state over art?
Blimey. Bloody hell, Taylor.
Yeah, I do. I do agree with that. Because at the end of the day, if you are going to put 100% into it, you have to sacrifice something. So whether that be your mental state, whether that be method acting, you lose weight for it, or you put weight on, you've got to sacrifice something to get the best out of something.
I do, but to some extent, if it were on a questionnaire. It's important to feel right making art. It's important you've got to know where you are mentally to make that kind of thing, obviously. So to sacrifice it, if you know the sacrifice will be worth it, then yes. But if you're just completely getting, like Shelley probably was, being abused into that kind of scenario, then no, it's not all right. So I'm on the fence, if you like.
No, I do not agree with that. I do agree to some extent, but mostly you should never put someone's mind and health on the line with the art. There always should be a line which tells where to end stuff.
Look, no one should ever be in a situation where they're bullied, whether that's in the arts, in a normal workplace, in everyday life. It's not acceptable. It doesn't matter if you're a genius or not. You don't bully people. If part of the process of getting something made and doing something unique, and everybody's understanding of that you might take risks and you might take chances to get to a certain point, I think that's another story. Whether Shelley Duvall had the opportunity to be able to talk about it, get help, get some sort of therapy on set, I don't know. I don't know what the backstory is. I know the legends of what she apparently went through to make that movie and what Kubrick put her through. Sometimes art is a difficult place to be, and I know actors, and we've read about actors who go to incredible lengths, sometimes self-destructive lengths, to get the best performance that they can possibly get. And whether Shelley Duvall was part of that process or it was a process inflicted on her, I don't think we'll ever really know. But it's not right. It's not a thing you can do, is to bully people unless you sort of have their consent as being part of that creative process.
Like it or not, it happened. And you could place your finger on many different factors, like the issues in Hollywood at the time, the treatment of women. Although Shelley Duvall's descent to illness was caused by one man's pursuit for perfection.
And a rendezvous. Your eyes held a message tender, saying I surrender all my love to you. Midnight brought us sweet romance. I know all my whole life through I'll be remembering you, whatever else I